it's just worth acknowledging what this all will be in a material sense, but also just sort of representing the kind of time we're in right now, in the context of what just happened very recently and what's happened over the course of really quite literally decades and centuries in this country. So let's talk about when this movement, Stop Cop City. I know we talked about the Hollywood studio as well, but particularly in protesting and occupying the forest. Could you talk about when? I can't remember if we talked about this already, but like when that started, and what are some of the kind of general tactics that have been employed over this time to prevent the furthering of this project, of the construction of this training center?
Yeah, so there was an initial occupation in right around November of 2021 that was broken up about a month later, and then reconstituted in January 2022. So from January 2022 until January 18th, 2023, there was a continuous occupation of the forest. Um, Police would engage in raids, and people might have left the forest, for several hours or time, but they would always return. It wasn't until the deadly raid that killed Tortuguita on the 18th that an actual occupation ended.
Mm.
Um, so over that time, there have been a variety of methods and tools used. Of course, like peaceful, nonviolent direct action of literally just putting your body where construction is supposed to be was the heart of much of it.
Hmm.
There was also more militant actions. There, sabotage was fairly common, but then there were nonviolent direct actions like protesting at houses of contractors or funders. At one point, activists like leafleted a church where one of I believe it was a cop city contract, where he attended church.
Mm.
Uh, they would put out flyers in neighborhoods saying, "Hey, this is your neighbor, and this is what your neighbor is doing."
Mm.
Um, then there were, of course, calling campaigns, email campaigns, and all sorts of variety of tactics from a tool bag. But of course, the one that will always be focused on by police in the state are the sabotage.
Right. Yeah, when they burn vehicles or buildings or other infrastructure, right? But I also want to kind of highlight, because this is not emphasized as much by the state, of course, is the tactics that they employ. So certainly it came to everyone's attention what happened, as you mentioned, Tortuguita, as they have been named. Their name is Manuel Esteban Paez Terran. They were murdered by police officers. And just very recently, an autopsy report came out from an independent kind of autopsy that was done, indicated several really significant things that contradicted the story that the police gave about what happened. If you could talk about what the police were saying, what happened, because again, there was some footage from a body cam, but it wasn't actually of the officers that were involved in that killing. But there were other officers who had made remarks, again, recorded on the body cam footage, that indicated something quite different happened than what the officers and what the police department was saying. So could you talk about that incident and give us some of the details of what the police said and then what inevitably came out from this autopsy report?
For sure. So the police narrative, or I should clarify, the GBI and GSP, so the state narrative, um, actually changed a couple times over the first 24 hours. The initial narrative was that Fort shot first and fired from cover and surprised officers who then returned fire. And then they later changed the story, and this was within 24 hours, changed the story. Fort was being given direction by officers and, opened fire while being given direction.
Mm.
Um, which, if you've ever watched a police officer react to anything, they're typically not very slow on their triggers.
No, yeah.
So one would imagine that if they were holding a gun and brought it up to aim at an officer, that it would have been difficult to get off shots. I'm not saying it's not impossible, and I certainly don't want to take away the agency from torts if they did indeed make that decision.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem like the facts are bearing that.
Right.
So the first autopsy was done by DeKalb County and the DeKalb County coroner's office, who told the family, gave them an early detail that Tort was shot over 13 times, but provided no further details.
Mm-hmm.
And it should also be said that at this point, um, per the state, that autopsy still hasn't been completed. The write up hasn't been done. Obviously, they are finished with Tort's body, and it was then given to the family to do a second autopsy.
Okay.
They still haven't provided their autopsy to the state as far as we have been told.
Mm.
So the second autopsy was done actually by a former GBI medical examiner. And that autopsy found that Tort was shot 14 times. The trajectories of those bullet wounds indicated that Tort was seated, slightly cross-legged, and at some point during the shooting, and the shooting took place over tens of seconds. It was quite long if you listen to the body cam footage from the initial burst of fire to the end. But at some point during that, Tort did raise their hands up and sort of facing towards their chest, so palms inward.
Mm-hmm.
That autopsy noted that there was no gunpowder residue found. It did note that gunpowder residue could have been washed off by the previous medical examiner, but it did say that that was unlikely. And then the body cam footage. So the Georgia State Police, their SWAT team were the ones who shot Tortita, and Georgia State Patrol is if no body cam requirement on their patrolmen or their troopers, as they call them.
Mm.
Their argument for that is that everything that GSP does would happen in front of their cruisers, and since their cruisers have cameras on them, they don't need body cameras themselves.
Okay.
So that is why there is no body camera footage from the GBI. However, we know there was a helicopter, there was a drone in the area. There are some other means of potentially seeing what happened. But what we do have are body camera footage, videos from the Atlanta Police Department's APEX team, which is a specialized team. It's actually similar to the Titans team that killed Tyree Nichols earlier this year. In fact, Apex replaced the Red Dog team, which is actually what Titan was inspired by. So we have an Apex officers, a group of Apex officers, sort of in the videos. We see them clearing tents, and then you hear an initial round of gunfire, and then a very long, sort of sustained round of gunfire. The officers kind of wend their way through the woods, and at one point you can hear one of the officers say, "You fucked your own officer."
You fucked your own officer.
So that was very noticeable, and we tweeted that out the night that the videos came out, and that prompted Georgia Bureau of Investigation, who was both partaking in that raid and is in charge of the supposedly independent investigation into the killing of Tortita. They tweeted out that extemporaneous commentary by an officer isn't really evidence of anything. And later we found out that so APD had initially promised to release more videos as they became available, but the Georgia Bureau of Investigations and the state's Attorney General office leaned on the Atlanta Police Department and the Law Department of the City of Atlanta, respectively, to stop the release of any more videos. So we haven't had any more videos, but there was another notable aspect of those videos is after the killing of Tortita, they continued to clear tents, and there was a very large focus on not having crossfire amongst the officers, which we had not seen prior to that. So another point that is indicative that they were aware that friendly fire was likely the cause of
Okay.
officer being shot.
Okay. Yeah, so there's obviously this happens over and over again when police do something like this where they kill some innocent person. They provide they change their story because as more evidence comes out, they have to kind of reformulate exactly how to save face. And so this isn't at all surprising. But what is, I think, a bit jarring and surprising is that this person, Totokoita, would have been just quite literally defenseless, sitting and getting shot and killed for probably, I mean, again, there's no evidence to indicate they had a firearm, that they were at all doing anything that would have, that the police could ever use as justification for killing them. So it is, to me, this is it feels like a kind of general escalation against the occupiers of this forest, in opposition to this training facility, this training center. So the I guess the general question I would ask next is after this killing occurred, what was the response of the occupiers, and then ultimately what came after that up to more recently? I know there were quite a few arrests that happened very recently. If you could talk a bit about exactly what happened to the movement after this murder, and then kind of bringing us up more to the present day.
Yeah. So post January 18th, we should, I guess, go back to December 13th when the initial round of domestic happened. There was a raid in the forest. Don't have the exact number in front of me. I want to say it was somewhere between 6 and 8 individuals who were arrested for domestic terrorism for the first time, and that sparked sort of a growing national attention to what was happening in the forest, and condemnation for these overbearing charges, which only grew exponentially after police killed Tortuguita. So post January 18th, there was this massive pouring in of support, sort of from leftist groups nationally. There were groups that were engaged in defense of activists from January 20th, from Trump's inauguration in 2016, who began pouring in legal support. There were organizers from other national orgs that began to offer sort of organizing help, and of course we had the national notoriety and more press and more media giving coverage of this. We also had a tonal shift in local media coverage, which had previously been pretty antipathetic towards activists, and now we're definitely a little stronger in not their condemnation of activists, in their doubt of the police narrative.
Right.
So those were pretty large shifts in what was happening. So activists had pulled out of the forest, and a decision was made to host a week of action. So this was their 5th week of action. These week of actions have typically been where they try to invite people from around the country who are interested in land defense and things like that. Come on down and essentially camp in the woods for a week and do protests. And there's always music raves and things like that. So it's a week of fun and also a week of protest and things of that nature. So for this 5th week of action, I would say this was the largest one yet. That was called for March 4th through 11th. And it marked a return to the forest on the first day, March 4th. Returns, set up camps. It was really sort of joyous day. There were definitely moments of mourning. There's a shrine to Tortuguita in the parking lot.
Hmm.
of Weelaunee People's Park that you can't help but see when you come in. And so I was watching as people would walk by and recognize what that was, and invariably they'd stop and have a moment of remembrance, which was incredibly touching to see at the time, and still to this day. And then they kicked off a 2-day music festival, which was arguably the largest draw of the entire week.
Hmm.
That was, I would say the centerpiece thing was having this 2-day music festival with some fairly well-known bands showing up. So that first day, Saturday, went off without a hitch, and then the second day, music festival started at noon that day. There was a bouncy castle in the middle of the field where it was being held,
Mm.
and that to me like set the tone of, okay, yeah, this is going to be that sort of lighthearted fun day,
Hmm.
and it was for the first few hours, for the first 5 hours or so. Everyone was just kind of enjoying themselves, and then a call went around, or word started to go around camp that there was going to be some sort of direct action. So at about 5 o'clock, about 200 people gathered and marched from um, this part of the forest, about a kilometer and a half away, to where the construction had started, where they were doing, at this point, they're doing erosion control work. They marched that pathway. It's about a 30-45 minute march, and then engaged in sabotage, essentially, and any of the infrastructure that was on the site was burned down, and then they returned and sort of dissipated into the forest, which sparked a overwhelming police response. I would say this is, even from 2020, this I think is the largest police response that I've ever seen. There were several hundred officers came into the forest and affected arrest what seems like random. They arrested, or they detained 35 people. They let 12 of those people go. From everything that we understand, those 12 individuals were locals.
Hmm.
Um, and the other 23, only one of them was local. And they've used this sort of outside agitated narrative. So it does seem like they were fluffing the numbers to really drive that narrative. But they charged all 23 of them with domestic terrorism.
Mm. Yeah.
And it can't be stressed strongly enough, like how random these arrests were, and there largely would have been no way for police to know who had partaken in this activity and who was just there to attend a concert. Eyewitness reports were, said that anyone who started to run was arrested, which I don't know if you've ever been charged at by police, but your instinct is to run away from an armed individual running at you.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay, so these people are been charged with domestic terrorism, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, this sort of post 9/11 world where, early, I remember back in the 2000s, I think there was quite a bit of, sort of green activism, people that were involved in these kind of movements, and they did engage in various forms of sabotage, arson, things like this. The FBI investigated them, found out who they were, and there were several of these activists that were charged with as domestic terrorists under these sort of post 9/11 laws that were passed. And it seems like we're seeing this happen in this situation as well, where people, and again, these charges are so. Didn't I hear something about people being charged based on the fact that they had mud on their shoes or something? Like the sort of circumstantial evidence they used for why they were up to no good was something around how dirty they were, or something like that. Am I correct in remembering that?
yeah, mud on shoes or clothing was
Mm.
one of the reasons. There was also one of the reasons was like, they were carrying metal shields,
Oh, right.
which I had seen. There were shields around the camp because at the first day they anticipated basically like a riot line of police, and they brought the plastic water barrel shields. There were
Mm.
no metal shields that I saw, but for the mud, the day before the week of action kicked off, we had a tornado warning in the city of Atlanta and a massive rainstorm.
Mm.
So not only are you in a forest, you're in a forest that had just been drenched by rain. And it is impossible not to be coated in mud and dirt. And you're at a music festival where people are sitting down. So, you're
Mm-hmm.
sitting down on a field that's just been soaked, you're probably going to come up with some mud.
Right.
So the evidence is incredibly flimsy, and it was commented by several of the attorneys, the defense attorneys, that it seemed like these charges were essentially copy pasted from one defendant to the other,
Mm-hmm.
and that's definitely indicative of a lack of solid grounds for these charges.